Howdy, everybody. So today we're going to do a lecture on Native Americans and the West. So this is about white and black Americans moving westward across ostensibly Indian territory and kind of the interactions with the Native Americans and ultimately the warfare that broke out between the U.S. Army and the different Native American nations. So when we think of the West, so before the Civil War, you can kind of see all the different regions that were settled. So all the little squares within each state, that's all the different counties. That's about the edge of where the settled territory was. So everything kind of West Texas, Oklahoma being primarily Indian territory, Kansas, the Nebraska territory, all that still dominated by Native Americans. Now, when we think about what this looks like, so once you kind of get past Central Texas, North Central Texas, and you get to West Texas, and kind of straight up from there, you're getting into the Great Plains. Now, at this point in time, it was called the Great American Desert. And they called it the Great American Desert because they thought, well, it's like a plains-like desert. It's grasslands, doesn't get much rain. Basically, only Native Americans, only Indians, and the buffalo can really live out here. They didn't think it was good for farming or any of this kind of stuff. That's going to change for a variety of reasons. But for now, like this is the perception that this is unlivable land. So when we think of the Great Plains, we got to think you're coming out in this big wide open area, and this is relatively short grass as a modern picture, but the grass would have been anywhere from about knee high to chest or over your head. So this would have had different varieties of grass that were massive, and they could sustain herds of bison, buffalo that were hundreds of thousands, if not millions, at a time. So you can see mountains in the background, and those are the Rockies. But that's a long ways off. This is just a big flat area. That's what these Great Plains are. So you go across the Great Plains, you get to the Rockies. This is one end of it. So the environment changes dramatically when you get to the Rockies, across them, and get to California, Washington, Oregon. So when we think of these Great Plains, this is kind of a defining barrier for the westward expansion. Because go to California, pretty great environment, pretty great place to live. Places like Colorado, uh, Oregon, and Washington, pretty nice places to live. But you get to the Dakotas, Montana, Utah, uh, New Mexico and Arizona, West Texas, Kansas, all these, Nebraska, all this area up here, it's flat, dry. The further south you get, the drier it gets, the true kind of desert environment. But the Great American Desert, the Great Plains, while grassland, it's still a hard place to make a living. But people did migrate westward. All kinds of people, black and white, migrated westward, particularly after the Civil War. After the Civil War, a lot of veterans wanted to get away from the memory of the Civil War, so they moved out west. A lot of African Americans that were former slaves wanted to escape things like black codes and eventually Jim Crow from the South. So they were moving out west. So there's a lot of reasons people left and were willing to take on this hardship, this test of their own skill as frontiers people, but they all went west, and they're going west in large numbers. Millions of people will travel westward over the next few decades. Now, one big drive is the Homestead Act of 1862. This is passed during the Civil War. It's a way to kind of help raise money. But this Homestead Act kind of did three major things. So it offered people lots of 160 acres of land, which that's pretty good. If you lived on the land for 5 years and improved it, so if you built a house, built a farm, you could buy it for only $10. Now, $10 at that point in time was, a reasonable amount of money. But for 160 acres, you could muster up $5. So this is a really good deal in order to be a landowner and free holding farmer. If you didn't want to wait the 5 years or improve it, if you wanted to kind of buy it outright and speculate on it, you could buy it for $1.25 an acre. So, 200 something dollars. Now that's a bigger price tag, but a lot of people, whenever they thought something was going to be a good place to live, like a town would form there or there was a big water source, you would have investors go try to buy up a bunch of land in that area in the hope they can resell it for a profit. So you have a group called exodusters. These are African Americans that are basically fleeing to Kansas. So this is, you can see an advertisement targeting African Americans. So these are people that wanted to leave the South, leave places, or they just wanted an opportunity to own large places of land. They're going to Kansas. Now, this is 1877. This is when some of the Indian land in Kansas, or some of the Indian lands in Kansas, are starting to be taken away due to the Native American wars. But we'll get to the wars in just a second. So these people are moving out, and this is going to be a hard life, but they endure, and they're going to make homes for themselves. You're going to have large black communities in some of these states. Like I mentioned earlier, you have land speculation. So people trying to buy land, trying to predict where population centers are going to be so they can buy it up and resell it for a higher value. Now they're wanting people to come out as well. The biggest factor of getting people out is going to be railroads. Railroads make the trip. You can, instead of taking months to get out there, you can take days or weeks to get out there. So the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862 is going to, also during the Civil War, is going to establish the Union Pacific Railroad. So this is going to be the Union Pacific and Central Pacific, and they're going to meet in Promontory Point, Utah. So one railroad's being built west, one's being built east, and they're going to meet in the middle. So you can see the big celebration. 1869, they meet. They drive a golden stake in the ground to join the two railroads together. They immediately pull it out because they can't leave gold in the ground. Someone would come steal it. But nonetheless, the symbolic stake is driven into the ground. And 1870, you have one railroad crossing the nation. Not long after, the next 10, 15 years, you have half a dozen railroads crossing. And the next 5, 10, 20 years after that, dozens crossing the nation. So very quickly, railroads begin connecting the whole United States together. You have more kind of propaganda saying, oh, you should move out west. You should go to Iowa, Nebraska, Utah, Kansas, all these different places. And they start kind of selling it as a positive thing. Now, what's interesting is the railroads were basically given land by the government to build their railroads on. They had to pay for it themselves to build the railroad, so they got investors and different things. But one of the big things the government gave them that to help pay for the building of the railroad is they gave them the land to build the railroad on. They also gave them acreage on either side of the railroad to build and sell, to build out like little towns and to sell to make up money to help do it. Now, we talked about all these Western lands being the Great American Desert. People didn't want to move out there. So the railroad companies, the land speculators, all these people are going to get together and they're going to change the image of the West. Now, if you notice this image of what some of these places look like, you see a lot of trees and a lot of different things. You're like, oh yeah, these are lands of milk and honey. You can grow anything, it rains, all this kinds of stuff. This is what it actually looked like, but they were selling them as this wonderful, Eden of a place to go live. They even went as far as kind of saying, everything can be grown out here. If you want to grow fruit, you can do that. If you want to raise animals, you can do that. All this kinds of stuff. They even got other people to kind of argue scientifically some other ways to encourage people to move out west. So some of them argue for things like dry farming, which are saying, oh, you can make the same amount of money in the east as you do in the west. You just have to grow and harvest more land in the west. So it takes less land in the east, you just have a little more land, but land's cheaper in the west, so it doesn't really matter. Then other science was brought in and says, oh, the rain will follow the plow. The only reason it doesn't rain in the Great Plains is because they haven't plowed it up yet. Not exactly true, but nonetheless, this is what they're arguing. They even get one Harvard professor to claim that because railroads had come to the west, it would change the electromagnetic field around the earth, and that would change rain patterns and bring rain to the Great Plains. None of this happened, and it's going to be a very rough first few years for many of these people out west. Now, as people moved west, they're going to start running into Native Americans. This is going to be a big, shocking kind of introduction to these Western worlds because all these Indian groups live out here and they're not too keen on having people come take their land and livelihood away from them. So in the South, you have groups like the Comanche that dominate West Texas. You have the Cheyenne, kind of central plains region. And in the north, you have the Sioux or the Lakota. So you have these powerhouse groups that really dominate the region, many of them nomadic. Great horsemen, particularly the Comanche were the best of all horsemen. And they are going to give the settlers and the U.S. Army a run for its money despite having severe numerical disadvantages. Now these are nomadic peoples. So whenever you think of teepees, kind of these tents they set up and tear down quickly made of buffalo hide, this are the groups of people, or these are the groups of people that live this lifestyle. They basically migrate, following the herds of buffalo around, using the buffalo pretty much for everything they need. Now, the buffalo are the true masters of the plains. Now, technically they're bison, like the species name is bison. So, but we call them buffalo because they look kind of like European style buffalo. So that's where they got that kind of name attached to them. But technically they're bison. Now, we often like to think of Native Americans as being these perfect environmentalists, they kill a single bison and use every part of it, which they did use a lot of the bison. They used the hide, they used the meat, bones, all the different things. But they weren't exactly at one with nature. The bison population by the time white and black people were settling the West was already in heavy decline because the Native American population was driving down the herd size because they were killing in excess numbers. One of the favorite ways to kill bison wasn't, like we see in movies or in pictures or paintings where they're riding, on horseback, shooting them with arrows. Well, that does happen. That's much later. That's like towards the end of this time period. Most of the time, the easiest way to hunt bison is to set a fire in the Great Plains, drive them over a cliff, so you kill 50, 100, 150 at once, and then you can harvest what you need, and the rest are left to rot. So other animals, vultures, different things come and eat, but you have a lot of waste in this process. So while they do use a lot of the bison, it's not always the most, perfect use of their resources. So it's not just, white and Western people that are screwing this up, but it's all people that don't always make good use of their resources. So the interactions with Native Americans are going to lead to some issues. So first you have the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864. So this is a group of Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples in the Colorado Territory. Things are going to get out of hand with the U.S. Army, and the U.S. Army is going to kill and mutilate somewhere between 70 and 500 of their people. Our best guess is about 175 based on testimony at the time. We don't 100% know, but the Army said very little, the Native American groups said a lot, so the best guess from what we can prove is about 175. The U.S. Army lost 24 men killed and 52 wounded. Now, what's really shocking is the U.S. Army took battle trophies. So they took scalps, which, if you don't know what a scalp is, it's where you hold the hair of the victim, stick a knife at the base of their kind of the front brow, and they drag the knife across as they pull the hair off to pull the hair and skin off, and that is a trophy. They took body parts and a lot of other grisly items, and they displayed them at Denver's Apollo Theater. So this is not oops, this was an accidental thing that just kind of went bad. There was kind of a malice to this. And this is kind of setting the tone for what was happening and what was going to happen over the next, 20, 30, 40 years. Now, what really went wrong at this massacre, this was partially a reprisal for some attacks from other Cheyenne groups, but the Cheyenne that were attacked during the Sand Creek Massacre, most of the chiefs that were killed during this attack were the chiefs that were actually pursuing peace with the U.S. Army. But the U.S. Army didn't differentiate between one group of Cheyenne and another. So this got really bad. So 8 of the Council of 44 of the Cheyenne were killed, and most of those were the ones seeking peace with the US. So this is going to set kind of a dark tone for the rest of the interactions and the beginning of the major Indian Wars. So the people that they were targeting were the Cheyenne Dog soldiers. So these were young men that were very militant and liked to strike out against white settlements. So the army was striking out against them, but they ended up killing the ones that were actually people like Black Kettle and Niwot that were actually suing for peace. And this is Colonel John Chivington that kind of led the massacre, and he's a piece of work all on his own. So they do a number and cause a lot of death and damage, and he is on the record not having much love for Native Americans. Now, one of the biggest factors that's really going to impact the Native Americans, aside from warfare, which we'll get to in a second, is the arrival of the railroads. Railroads were crisscrossing the Great Plains, and as they were building these railroads, they needed to feed the men working on them. So you have bison out on these Great Plains, and they don't know to fear gunfire. So you can just keep shooting bison after bison and they won't stampede. So you have massive bison hunting becoming a popular, viable business. And they're literally just killing the bison, taking the hide to sell the hide, and leaving the meat to rot. You know, the railroad workers will eat some of it, but as hunting becomes more popular, this goes awry. So a Philadelphia tanner bought about 57 of these buffalo hides in 1871 for $200. And when he realized they made such good leather, he bought or ordered 2,000 more. And as other leather workers learned of buffalo hide and its value, the demand for it skyrocketed. So within only about 10 years, these buffalo hunters would slaughter 3.5 million bison. So to tell you one quick story, so you're killing about 15 bison an hour. So here's some examples of kind of what it was like. So one buffalo hunter named Billy Dixon is quoted saying, "No mercy was shown the buffalo. I killed as many as my 3 men, his skinners, could handle, working them as hard as they were willing to work. This was deadly business without sentiment. It was dollars against tenderheartedness, and dollars won." One hunter named Orlando Brown killed 5,700 in the first 2 months of 1876 alone. He fired his .50 caliber rifle so many times that he went deaf in one ear. The ear he shot on that side, he went deaf in that ear because he shot it so many times in such close succession. So they're literally shooting the bison, butchering it for its hide, and moving on. So these are bison skulls stacked. So you can see the kind of carnage that was being wreaked across the Great Plains. And while this is bad for an ecological reason and an animal rights reason, it's also bad because this is what sustained and maintained the independence of the Native American tribes on the Great Plains. By 1883, the buffalo hunters went out to slaughter that year's herd, and they found that virtually none were left. And this is not happening just to bison, but elk experience the same thing. You see grizzly bears being pushed to the brink of extinction. White-tailed deer are being pushed to the brink, as well as wolves. It is not going to be to the past, or not until the past 100 years or so, kind of turn into the 1900s, 1920, 1930, that we start seeing some of these populations start coming back due to better wildlife management as a result of different acts that we'll talk about later in the semester. So this is rough. You have a lot of waterfowl, things that are being hit as well. But it's going to be the Native Americans, as far as a human impact, that are going to be hit the worst by these hunting practices. So this is going to be a problem that leads ultimately to war with the Indians, because as their ability to live free on the Great Plains slowly dwindles, as the herds dwindle, the Indians are going to be lashing out against the U.S. Army and white settlements. So let's start in the South, in Texas, with Quanah Parker, the last chief of the Comanche. Now, Quanah Parker is the son of Pettinacona, a Comanche chief, and Cynthia Ann Parker, a white woman who was basically adopted into the tribe and bore the chief's son and kind of adopted the Native American way of life. So he goes by the name Quanah Parker. He's kind of the last great war chief of the Comanche. So there's Pettinacona, and that's Cynthia Ann Parker in her Native American garb. So he is going to lead a raid called the Battle of Adobe Walls. Now, Adobe Walls was this old kind of Spanish outpost made of adobe that is kind of where buffalo hunters set up camp because it was elevated, had some walls, provided a little bit of shelter. Now, at the Battle of Adobe Walls, Quanah Parker is going to lead a war party of 700 Comanche, Kiowa, and Cheyenne against some buffalo hunters. Now, you're going to, anywhere between half a dozen to a dozen buffalo hunters are going to manage to hold off the 700-man Comanche raiding force. They do it because they have very high caliber long-range rifles that are able to shoot at a much greater distance than the Native American bow and arrows or their guns. So they manage to keep them at a distance, but when the U.S. Army hears from these buffalo hunters that a big war party attacked their outpost, the U.S. Army cannot stand for Native Americans attacking American citizens. So they launch what's known as the Red River Wars. This is where the U.S. Army begins chasing the Comanche all around the Llano Estacado, this big plateau in the northwestern kind of panhandle region of Texas, with all these little valleys and rivers all up in here. And they're going to spend about a year chasing the Native Americans, chasing the Comanche around. So you have big battles like Palo Duro and all these other ones. And over the course of a year, they managed to force the Comanche to surrender. And one of the primary tactics they use is whenever they find it, they destroy the winter rations, the winter kind of hoard of the Comanche. While the U.S. forces can, just make a call and a train will arrive and drop off new supplies, if the Indian supplies are destroyed, they just starve. And that was the way the U.S. Army is going to make a big difference at this time, is by depleting the Comanche of their ability to eat, to force them to surrender and come into the reservations. So by June of 1875, the Comanche are going to be forced to surrender and come onto the reservations. When gold is found in the Black Hills in the north, so you can see South Dakota where the Black Hills are, this is going to be on Sioux ancestral territory. So this is like important territorial to the Sioux or the Lakota. Gold miners start moving in, conflict with the Sioux erupts, and the U.S. government offers to buy the Black Hills for $6 million. The Sioux refuse because it's important land to them. So the U.S. Army goes in to forcibly remove the Sioux because these white settlers are being attacked as they look for gold. So the U.S. Army is sent in, and Sitting Bull, one of the chiefs of the Sioux, is going to mobilize probably the single biggest Native American resistance on the Great Plains. Now he puts together this group. He says, we must stand together or they will kill us separately. These soldiers have come shooting. They want war. All right, we'll give it to them. And he's going to be one of the main forces that stands against U.S. encroachment on Indian territory. Now, along the Little Big Horn River in June of 1876, the Native Americans are going to have, the Sioux in particular, are going to have the most successful victory over the U.S. Army. This will be known as Custer's Last Stand, named for George Armstrong Custer, who led the U.S. forces against the Native Americans. Now, he had about 250 soldiers, and during the Civil War, Custer was known for rapid charges. So you charge with your cavalry in, hit the enemy real quick, guns blazing, and they break, and it's a huge victory. Works great. And as long as the enemy force isn't too big and you hit them hard and fast, it generally works. Problem was, Custer did not properly scout the enemy force, and the enemy camp, the Sioux camp he ended up attacking along the Little Bighorn River, was about 3,000 Native Americans. So 250 US soldiers against 3,000 Indians. This is going to make for very short work for the Native Americans. They very quickly surround Custer and his forces, and they wipe him out. Now, this is going to have unintended consequences for the Native Americans. While this is a huge victory for them, it's going to turn popular opinion against the Native Americans. Instead of being this kind of, within their words at the time, noble savages that needed to be respected and treaties made with, many Americans are going to see them as kind of a hostile enemy that needs to be put down, that needs to be quelled. So no longer are they going to be somewhat respected, they're going to be an enemy that needs to be defeated. So war will continue for a while. Eventually, by uh, the 1880s, the Sioux will come onto reservations as well. In the New Mexico, Arizona era, you have Geronimo, a medicine man of the Apache, who will lead much of the resistance there. Now, he had kind of a guerrilla style of warfare, nowhere near the size of the Sioux or the Comanche. And they had an interesting tactic. They would fight the U.S. Army until they ran out of resources, and they would kind of fake surrender, go onto the reservations, get food, rest, then they would leave again and start fighting the U.S. Army. And they did this for a while, for about almost a decade of these kind of false surrenderings. Now, eventually, after intense pursuit by the U.S. Army around northern Mexico, Geronimo surrendered to Lieutenant Charles Bear Gatewood in 1886. So both he and Sitting Bull would make a name for themselves partially in these wars, but partially after the wars, kind of traveling, trying to raise awareness for the Native American cause. Sitting Bull traveled with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. Geronimo went to various world fairs, all these kinds of things. So they were able to make a name for themselves in different ways. So Crazy Horse, another one of the chiefs, actually becomes a big rancher and has a huge ranch and makes a name for himself that way. Now you see the various Apache reservations to the Navajo. The Navajo are one of the few that were given back some of their ancestral land as their reservation, partially because it was not conducive for Western American style farming, so the land was seen as not as valuable. It was given back to the Navajo. Now, what are the factors that ultimately led to the defeat of the Native Americans? So one is technology. So railroads, telegraphs, you have the revolving pistol, so you can shoot 6 times very quickly. You carry 2 of those, that's 12 shots before you have to reload. You get the repeating rifle, it's anywhere between 6 to 11 shots with just a lever action. So you can shoot, 20, 30 times without having to reload, depending how many guns you have on you. The biggest factor is going to be massive waves of immigrants. There's about 500,000 Native Americans on the Great Plains at this point in time. They simply can't stand against the flood of people, the millions of black and white settlers moving onto the Great Plains, just slowly drowning them out, just creating a pressure upon the Native American groups and putting them on basically between a rock and a hard place. So slowly you have the surrender of these different groups. So Indians pushed on to the reservation. So Quanah Parker and the Comanche, 1875, Sitting Bull and the Sioux in 1881, and Geronimo and the Apache, 1886. These are the years that the last major resistance was mounted for each of the various tribes and nations. But that's not quite the end of the story with the Native Americans. Once they're on reservations, you have another issue. Native American culture. Now, there's this idea in the United States of you kill the Indian to save the man. So this is basically a whitewashing of Native American culture. So they take a Native American child and try to whitewash them, make them white. So they turn children like these, they take them away from their families, send them off to boarding schools, and convert them into what they see as proper American children. Now, the fundamental issue with trying to whitewash Native Americans is white America never will accept them as white. Because they're not white, the racist vision of this time period, no matter how hard many of these Native American children try to assimilate and adopt white culture, it doesn't really work. But what you do have is basically a cultural genocide. We never try to commit genocide against the people themselves, but we definitely, as a nation, try to wipe out their culture. So the three overwhelming factors to the downfall that we've been talking about: overwhelming migration numbers, the millions of immigrants, the slaughter of the buffalo, and then the various pieces of technology. So I'll stop there for today, and we will pick up with a new lecture next time. Y'all have a great day.